Okay, can we turn to Revelation chapter 8? And can somebody read for me Revelation 8, verses 2 through 6?
So verses 2 through to 6
Yep,
of chapter 8.
that's it.
And I saw the 7 angels which stood before God, and to them were given 7 trumpets. And another angel came and stood at the altar, having a golden censer, and there was given unto him much incense, that he should offer it with the prayers of all the saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. And the smoke of the incense which came with the prayers of the saints ascended up before God out of the angel's hand. And the angel took the censer and filled it with fire of the altar and cast it into the earth. And there were voices and thunderings and lightnings and an earthquake. Do you want to verse 7, eh?
Verse 6.
Verse 6. And the 7 angels which had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound.
Okay. So we've just finished with the 7 seals. And this is the very next thing we read in verse 2 of chapter 8. What are we presented with here? What is the next scene that Revelation shows us?
It's the 7 trumpets.
Mm-hmm.
So, given the fact that the 7th seal is the second coming, then the 7, are we now going back in time, as it were, to a different aspect of what's being covered, like with the 7 churches and the 7 seals? Now we've got 7 trumpets going through the sort of same time frame, because the 7 trumpets starting after the second coming, that doesn't make a lot of sense to me. It would make sense if it's the same time frame but different events, or the events from a different angle, whether some are religious, some could be political, some could be military, some could be whatever. I'm guessing that's what's happening.
Mm-hmm.
Well, the prayers of the saints are still going.
Verse 1 should be with the previous chapter, because there was no chapter breaks, and so it looks like it fits with this, but it doesn't. So if you don't put the chapter there, it would just keep going.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. So as you said, we're opening with the 7 trumpets. One thing I found interesting here is verse 2. It talks about, we see 7 angels standing before God, and they're given the 7 trumpets. But then they're interrupted by another angel who comes to offer up incense. And then after that angel's done, in verse 6, we're back to, and the 7 angels which had the 7 trumpets prepared them to sound. So during this time, we're introduced to the 7 angels where they're given their trumpets. There's this other angel that comes that interrupts them to do its little bit. And I just want to look at that for a moment. What is this angel doing? Okay, this angel that interrupts the 7 angels. What's he there to do?
There was given to him much incense.
Mm-hmm.
that he should offer it with the prayers of all saints upon the golden altar which was before the throne. So the prayers of all saints are being offered up with much incense.
Yep, the prayers of the saints are being offered up upon the altar of incense, and they're ascending up before God out of the angel's hand.
I just thought it was interesting that it's all saints and much incense. I don't know if there's any significance in that or not. I don't know.
Then there's obviously a significant event, because in verse 5, with the earthquakes and thunderings and lightnings where they've been before, there's been significant events. So that would indicate that, wouldn't it?
Now, if we're looking at offering up the prayers of the saints, in the book of Revelation, can we think of anything that's where specifically talked about the saints offering up prayers, or about the saints calling out, the voice of the saints being heard calling to God? Remember, we looked at this when we looked at the seals.
The one where they're under the altar crying out, "How long, O God?"
6, chapter 6.
Yep. Do you want to jump back to that? Under the fifth seal.
9 and 10.
Yep, that's it. Do you want to read that out for us? Revelation 6, 9 and 10.
And when he had opened the fifth seal, I saw under the altar the souls of them that were slain for the word of God and for the testimony which they held. And they cried with a loud voice, saying, How long, O Lord, holy and true, dost thou not judge and avenge our blood on them that dwell on the earth?
So we have this cry, these saints crying out to God, okay, from the altar, right? And then here at the beginning of the trumpets, we have the angels standing at the altar offering up the prayers of the saints. It's almost as if Revelation is depicting what's happening here is an answer to the prayers of those saints. Those saints are crying up, how long, O God, till you avenge our blood? How long till you judge those who are persecuting us? And what is the response after these prayers are offered up? What happens next?
The censer is thrown into the earth.
Yep. In Revelation 8, verse 5, the angel took the censer, filled it with fire from the altar, and cast it to the earth. Now we have, yes, good night again. Off you go. Sorry about that. I just want to jump back to to Ezekiel. Now, in Ezekiel 8 and 9, I'm sure we're all familiar with the sealing there. In Ezekiel 8, God shows Ezekiel all these various abominations that Israel is committing. Then in Ezekiel chapter 9, a man is sent with a writer's inkhorn to put a mark upon the foreheads of those that sigh and cry for the abominations in Israel, to seal his people. And then others are sent, said, start at the sanctuary and absolutely slay everyone that doesn't have this mark on them. But something interesting happens at the end of this chapter and going into chapter 10. Can somebody read Ezekiel 9, verse 11 through to chapter 10, verse 2?
And behold, the man clothed with linen, which had the inkhorn by his side, reported the matter, saying, I have done as thou hast commanded me. Then I looked, and behold, in the firmament that was above the head of the cherubims, there appeared over them, as it were, a sapphire stone, as the appearance of the likeness of a throne. And he spake unto the man clothed with linen, and said, Go in between the wheels, even under the cherub, and fill thine hand with coals of fire from between the cherubims, and scatter them over the city, and he went in my sight.
So when it says that the man clothed with linen had the inkhorn reported saying, I have done as thou commanded me. What had he just finished doing?
Marking.
He had finished the sealing. And after he had finished the sealing, after the sealing of God's people was complete, what was the next thing that he was to do?
Grab the coals of fire.
Yep. And do what with
and
them?
Scatter them over the city. So this is the same angel doing both jobs.
Yep. And here in Ezekiel, it's the sealing. When it's the sealing angel, he's finished sealing the servants of his God on their foreheads. He then takes coals of fire from between the cherub and scatters it over the city. So what would that indicate then? What is this indicating?
Is the man clothed with linen Jesus?
He's not identified. I've always just understood it to be an angel.
Okay.
Wouldn't Christ be dressed in fine linen as opposed to just linen?
He's the one who seals them, though. That man clothed with linen, the man clothed with linen, he seals the people. So doesn't Jesus do that? Anyway,
How I understand this is, if we look through this process, whoever this person clothed with linen is, their job was to seal God's people. Once the sealing of God's people is complete, their next job is to pour out the coals from the altar between the cherubs to cast it upon the city. To me, this clearly indicates this idea that probation is being closed and the judgment is being poured out. Now, if we jump back into Revelation 8, we see a similar thing happening here. Petra.
So this strife that's represented by the coals is that, so we understand probation closes for the house of God. Is that what's happening here, or is this probation closing for everybody?
There in Ezekiel, that judgment in that specific situation is simply talking about the city of Jerusalem that it's being poured out on. You know, the coals are poured over that city. Okay. However, in Revelation, we see it's a far larger scale. Okay, the coals from the fire is cast upon the earth. Okay, and the sealing that happens in chapter 7 is of God's people throughout the whole earth. And so Ezekiel gives us a picture of the sealing and of sort of the close of probation, but in a localized picture of what's happening in Jerusalem at the time of Ezekiel. But we see the same pattern repeating in Revelation, but on a scale that encompasses the whole earth.
So this smaller scale here doesn't mean that this is after the sealing of God's people, but before the sealing of everybody, is that it looks like the probation being closed for everyone?
Yeah, I'd say it's closed for everyone. And so when we jump back into Revelation 8, again, we see this angel, he offers up the prayers of the saints. And then as a response to that, that censer that was filled up with the prayers of the saints is now filled with fire from the altar and cast to the earth. And then we hear voices, thunderings, lightnings, and earthquakes. Now, can somebody read for me Revelation 16, verse 18 and see what we find there.
There were voices and thunders and lightnings, and there was a great earthquake, such as was not since men were on the earth, so mighty an earthquake and so great.
Now we see that the same things that were the result of that angel casting down that fire to the earth, the voices, thunders, lightnings, and a great earthquake, those same things are all present here in this verse. Now, what event is this talking about here?
The destruction of the wicked in the earth, well, the surface.
Yep.
After the second coming, like I don't know, but they happen the same time or immediately before or after or something.
Well,
the one in Revelation 16.
Yeah.
It's the seventh angel pouring out his vial in the air, and there were voices and thunders and lightnings.
Yep, so that's the seventh plague.
So is this the same angel?
Sorry, you're breaking up there, Margarita. What was that?
Is this the same angel as the seventh one from chapter 16 that's here in chapter 8?
I wouldn't say so. It's hard to tell exactly because these angels don't all have names. But this is simply the seventh angel pouring out his plague upon the earth. And so this final plague that's poured out, we hear voices, thunders, lightnings, and a great earthquake. So it seems to indicate that this angel, he offers up prayers, casts down, which we talked about being the close of probation, and then we see the same things unfolding that take place in the final plague, which is what happens, you know, right up to it's at the second coming of God, where you know, the final wicked is destroyed. But we also see these same things happening in Revelation 11. Revelation 11, verse 19. Can someone read that for us?
And the temple of God was opened in heaven, and there was seen in his temple the ark of his testament, and there were lightnings and voices and thunderings and an earthquake and great hail.
So we see those same elements present there. And what is this verse given in the context of Revelation? Sorry, what is the context in Revelation in which we find this verse? What does this stuff happen under?
Seventh trumpet.
Be
the last woe.
Yep. So this angel at the beginning of chapter 8, the result of what it does leads to these pouring out of the voices, thunders, lightnings, and earthquake, which is what we find under the seventh trumpet and the seventh plague. But here we see this angel presented at the very beginning of the trumpets. So this seems to be out of sequence with other stuff that we read. And so I just want to put this question: what do we think about how do we harmonize that with what we're seeing here?
Could it be to give context? I don't know what, but or like kind of like chapter 7 was kind of like an interlude to explain something.
Mhm.
almost like you would put it in parentheses or something like that.
Yep, yep. I would agree with that completely.
Can you
The
repeat what Galen said?
sorry,
Can
what
you
was?
repeat what Galen?
Oh, this is given to give context to the trumpets. It's sort of foreshadowing what the end of them will be. Okay. This angel is offering up the prayers of the saints. The prayers of the saints are what we saw under the fifth seal, with the saints crying out for all the suffering and all the martyrs being put to death and all the things that they are enduring. Okay. And this angel is offering up those prayers, and as a result, judgment is being cast down from heaven. And that takes us right up to the close of probation and the final destruction under the seventh trumpet, which parallels with the seventh plague. And so it's sort of foreshadowing what is going to come. The trumpets here are given in the context of judgments being poured out in answer to the prayers of God's people suffering in their persecution.
I wish I'd said all that. Sorry.
But like God hearing our prayers, Galen, he translates what he knows our heart means. It's very
Yeah.
similar.
Okay, I'll go with that. I'll accept that.
Now, under the fifth seal, when we saw the saints crying out and the martyrs crying out, we saw in the previous horse messages for the riders on the horses, especially the red horse, the black horse, and the pale horse, or the death, the suffering, the war, the persecution that was going on. Okay, who was God's people suffering at the hands of?
The little horn.
Yep, the little horn, which is
Papacy.
yep, yes, the papacy. But was it the popes, the bishops, and the cardinals themselves? There was union going on.
They were using the kings of the earth at the time, the governments and those in positions of power. Well, those that like to think they're in positions of power half the time.
These martyrs could include those under the Roman Empire and those under the Jewish persecutions as well.
Yep, absolutely.
Like under Nero and such.
Yes, going back to Nero, his persecution, what happened under, especially Diocletian, just before the Edict of Tolerance was signed. There was all that persecution under the Roman state. And then after Constantine, it was still became persecution at the hands of the Roman state. It was just at the request or the authority of the Bishop of Rome that the nations of the Roman Empire, that where was the Holy Roman Empire or what was the Byzantine Empire, or before the split, the actual Roman Empire itself, these state powers were persecuting God's people. And when we're going through the trumpets, we're going to see, especially the first four, we see, like with the seals, they were grouped in the first four, and then there was a change for the last three. We're going to see the same thing going through here. These first four are judgments that are being poured out on that power that was persecuting God's people. Okay, on the Roman power. And so that's the context we're given there. We're introduced to these seven angels standing before the throne of God, and they're given seven trumpets. Okay, but then it's like Revelation says, hold up. We need to show you something else before we carry on with these trumpets, so we can understand. These trumpets are in response to the persecution of God's people that they received at the hands of this Roman power. Okay, and in response to these prayers, God is pouring out judgments upon them, and that these judgments will lead right up to the closing of probation and these final punishments to be poured out. And then again in verse 6, we're reintroduced to the trumpets. And the 7 angels which had the 7 trumpets prepared themselves to sound. Now, the last thing I want to look at before we actually get into the first trumpet is trumpets themselves. Okay, just trumpets themselves. How were they used in the Bible?
Announcements.
Mhm.
They were, like we looked, no, that was the other one. That was our Tuesday night one. At the Feast of Trumpets, the Feast of Trumpets actually didn't do anything as such, but it was an announcement that something was going to be happening. It was a call.
Mhm.
It was saying that something's about to happen.
Yep, something's about to happen to get ready.
Prepare, yeah.
Do you remember in Numbers, they're given trumpets, told to make silver trumpets, and there was 4 separate things that they were to be used to announce. Maybe we'll turn back to Numbers 10.
Day of Atonement coming up, which was actually the feast.
Mhm.
Isn't it war?
Yep, war was one of them.
Breaking up of camp and leaving.
Yes.
I know there was a breaking up of camp, leaving. I guess it was like the military today. They use it for different sounds means different things. So, you know, you wouldn't use the call out for leaving necessarily when you're coming up to Day of Atonement. That there'll be 2 different, I presume, types of calls.
Mhm.
Yeah, different rhythms or different whatever it is that they do. I would imagine.
Yep. Do you want to read Numbers chapter 10, verse 2 to 4? And ask the question, what is the trumpet used for here?
2 to 4. Make thee 2 trumpets of silver, of a whole piece shalt thou make them, that thou mayest use them for the calling of the assembly and for the journeying of the camps. And when they shall blow with them, all the assembly shall assemble themselves to thee at the door of the tabernacle of the congregation. And if they blow but with 1 trumpet, then the princes which are heads of the thousands of Israel shall gather themselves unto thee.
So what are we told the trumpets are used for there?
Assembly.
Yep.
And for journeying.
Assembling and for journeying. Yep. And if we jump down, verse 9 and 10.
And if ye go to war in your land against the enemy that oppresseth you, then ye shall blow an alarm with the trumpets, and ye shall be remembered before the Lord your God, and ye shall be saved from your enemies. Also in the day of your gladness, and in your solemn days, and in the beginnings of your months, ye shall blow with the trumpets over your burnt offerings, and over the sacrifices of your peace offerings, that they may be to you for a memorial before your God. I am the Lord your God.
So that gives us another 2 reasons here the trumpets are to be used.
Or
Yep, war and
celebrations and a memorial.
yep.
But it's gladness and solemn days.
It says the beginning of month, so that's new moons as well.
So be over the different I'll say celebrations and different events that they were to mark in a certain way. For a memorial, yeah.
Mhm. So jump back into Revelation chapter 8 and keep in mind that trumpets were used for calling the congregation together, for organizing them when they were to journey and go traveling, for celebration of their feasts and new moons, and for war. So those are the four applications that trumpets could be used for. Now, when we read the first trumpet, I want to ask the question, which one of these four applications does this fit? Okay, is the trumpet here, is this being blown? Does the context of this fit being blown for war, for celebration, for journeying, or for assembly? Can somebody read for me Revelation 8 and verse 7?
I can do so.
Yes, thank you.
The first angel blew his trumpet, and there followed hail and fire mixed with blood, and these were thrown upon the earth. And a third of the earth was burned up, and a third of trees were burned up, and all green grass was burned up.
So the symbols there, which one of those contexts of the trumpets does that fit?
War.
War. All right, so, and as we go through with the other ones, we're going to see similar things, that these trumpets fit the context of war. Okay, so we're looking at war, the trumpets, we're looking at judgment upon Rome as it was persecuting God's people. Okay, so those are sort of the contextual things that we're looking at here when we look to the fulfillment of these prophecies. Now, where else have we seen hail and fire coming down? Does
11:19 hail.
Yep, hail pops up again in the 11:19. That's the 7th trumpet. There is an Old Testament reference. If we jump back to,
The only thing I can think of would be fire, would be like Elijah on Mount Carmel, or Sodom and Gomorrah.
yep. We'll read a few verses from the Old Testament. If you turn to Exodus 9.
16:21's got hail too.
Yep.
Okay, Exodus 29.
21, that's the 7th plague. Yes, the 7th trumpet and the 7th plague both have hail in them. Can somebody read Exodus 9, verse 23 and 24?
And Moses stretched forth his rod toward heaven, and the Lord sent thunder and hail, and the fire ran along upon the ground, and the Lord rained hail upon the land of Egypt. So there was hail and fire mingled with the hail, very grievous, such as there was none like it in all the land of Egypt since it became a nation.
So what's that speaking of there?
It's the 7th plague, isn't it?
Yeah, is one of the plagues being poured out upon Egypt. And when it describes thunder and hail and fire running along the ground. Now, just a point I want to note here is often in the Old Testament, or in Hebrew, they use the same word for fire and lightning. so here when they talk about thunder and hail and fire running along the ground, it seems to be describing a big thunderous hailstorm and the lightning's falling, crashing and arcing everywhere. And we'll notice in a few other ones that they use this interchangeably. So, but this here again was a plague being poured out to judge the people who were oppressing God's people. And I'll just look at another couple of verses. Psalms 78 in verse 47 and 48.
I'll read that, Matthew.
Yep.
He destroyed their vines with hail and their sycamore trees with frost. He gave up their cattle also to the hail and to the flocks to hot thunderbolts.
So again, there's the same plague there, and how does it describe it?
Hail with frost and hot thunderbolts. Hot thunderbolts obviously would be fire of some sort.
Mm.
In my Bible, it says, or lightnings, the translation.
Yep, and that's just showing there that sometimes when they say hail and fire, sometimes hail and hot thunderbolts.
My one says under frost, it says all great hailstones.
Mm-hmm.
As an alternative.
My margin actually says for hot thunderbolts, it's actually got the word lightnings.
Mm-hmm. Yep. And to jump back into Revelation chapter 8. So under this first trumpet, we see the reference is to one of these plagues of Egypt that fell down and caused destruction on those that were persecuting God's people. Now, what do you think it means if we carry on reading there in Revelation 8 verse 7, when it talks about there was hail and fire mingled with blood, and they were cast upon the earth, and a third part of the trees was burned up, and all the green grass was burned up. Now we see this a third being referred to quite a bit throughout the trumpets. We've got it there on the first trumpet there in verse 7. In verse 9, we also read that a third part of the creatures which were in the sea that had life died, and a third part of the ships were destroyed. Then in verse 10, again, we read that a third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of water were burned up by this great star that fell from heaven. And again in verse 12, under the fourth angel, a third part of the sun was smitten, and a third part of the moon, and a third part of the stars, and a third part of them was darkness.
Also the last part of verse 8.
Mm-hmm.
Third part of the sea became blood.
The third part of the sea became blood.
So it's every verse.
Mm-hmm. So we see throughout these first 4 trumpets, this repeated idea that the judgment is falling upon a third. So the question is, what is the significance of that? does anyone have any ideas? Why do we think it's only a third part of these that are being destroyed and judged? Yes, Galen?
I'm thinking like what happened to the great earthquake in Lisbon and the dark day and the moon being a blood moon. It wasn't global, but it was a big chunk of the earth. And if every one of these trumpets or the events that are contained therein, if every one of those events happened all over the world, there'd be nothing left. Or is that actually the point? Or is it more of a case of, okay, this part of the world gets this plague, another part of the world gets this plague, another part of the world gets this bit, and would the judgment that they get depend on what their would be relative, that the punishment fits the crime type situation? Because we're told in the flood or after the flood that those places where like the gold and the gems and that were exalted more, they were buried down further. So I'm wondering if it's a similar situation.
Norm, how you going?
Get on here.
Yep, we can. Your sound came on and then it disappeared again. All right, I think he's just adjusting his camera. All right. Yes, Galen, I think that is an idea that these judgments are not universal. It's not destroying everything. And I want us to compare some of the stuff we see here. For example, there in the first trumpet, it was cast upon the earth. Now, can somebody read for me Revelation 16 and verse 2? And this is dealing with the first plague. And where is the first plague poured out upon?
People.
Yeah, can somebody read that? Revelation 16 verse 2.
So the first angel left the temple and poured out his bowl on the earth, and horrible malignant sores broke out on everyone who had the mark of the beast and who worshipped his statue.
So the first trumpet, those things were cast upon the earth. Here, under the first plague, the vial is poured out upon the earth. Now, can somebody read verse 3, Revelation 16 verse 3? And where is the second plague poured out upon?
And the second angel poured out his vial upon the sea, and it became as the blood of a dead man, and every living soul died in the sea.
So that one was poured out upon the sea. Now I'm just going to read Revelation 8 and verse 8. And the second angel sounded, as it were a great mountain burning with fire, or was cast into the sea. And a third part of the sea became blood. And a third part of the creatures which were in it and had life died. Now, can somebody read out Revelation 16 and verse 4? Revelation 16 verse 4. And what is that vial being poured out upon?
And the third angel poured out his vial upon the rivers and fountains of waters, and they became blood.
So the third plague was poured out upon the rivers and the springs of the fountains of water. Now I'm going to read back in Revelation 8 verse 10. We read, "And the third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven, burning as it were a lamp, and it fell upon a third part of the rivers and upon the fountains of waters." And so we see the plagues and the trumpets that are falling upon the same things in their order. And now, can somebody read the verse 8, Revelation 16 verse 8? This is the fourth plague.
And the fourth angel poured out his vial upon the sun, and power was given unto him to scorch men with fire.
And now I'm going to read Revelation 8 verse 12. "And the fourth angel sounded, and a third part of the sun was smitten, and a third part of the moon, and a third part of the stars also." And so we see with these first four trumpets parallel the first four plagues. Okay, but the difference is these plagues are these are the final plagues, okay, that lead right up to the second coming, right? But these trumpets, they're being poured out on these things in the same order, but the judgment's only falling upon a third of them. Okay, we're not speaking about complete destruction. Okay, after the seventh plague, okay, the earth is rendered uninhabitable. Okay, Christ returns, everything's destroyed. But these trumpets are significant judgments, but they're not the final judgments. Okay, it's the same things are being judged, but only a third. And so in these judgments in the trumpets, God is still showing mercy.
So do you think that's what's going on now, Matthew? That people are getting another opportunity to change?
Yeah, I think right up until Christ leaves the sanctuary, people are getting more opportunities. And I think that's one of the things, in that final day of judgment, God presents everyone's cases before them, sort of in panorama, so they can see their lives, and they will see how many chances God gave them, how many times God tried to wake them up, all the judgments that God gave them, and all the times that it occurred to them that, wow, maybe, this is real, maybe I need to change. And then they just, shut their conscience down and listen to it. And that's why they all, every knee shall bow and every tongue confess. When they realize all the opportunities God gave, that they turned away. Galen.
I'm just looking at verse 12 in chapter 8 with regards to the sun, moon, and stars. Was that to do with the dark day? Because a third part of the sun was eclipsed. That makes it a wee bit darker. That, sort of like, so what? But if it's a case of a big chunk of, the known world at that time, in America, would that be classed as a third part where it happened, as opposed to a third part of the bit? A third part of the sun or a third part of the moon? I don't know. I'm just, because it sounds like the dark day to me.
Yeah, well,
I don't know.
There is a parallel in there. We saw under the sixth seal that the sun was darkened, the moon became blood, and all those signs in the heaven happening. I would, however, to me, in the trumpets here, it's seen as being in a different context. yeah, in the seals, we follow those through the darkening of the sun, the moon becoming by the falling of the stars, the earthquake. These things are seen as being very literal signs that is happening. And here in the trumpets, there is a sort of a change of language between literal and symbolic. But these are ones with it being a third part. It's not just a third part of the sun, it's a third part of the moon, a third part of the stars didn't shine, a third part of the day didn't shine, a third part of the night likewise. I see that to be more symbolic in nature. And also because it's in the context of the trumpets, which are judgments given against the power that has been persecuting God's people.
Oh, yeah, no, that doesn't, yeah. And the dark day really doesn't match, does it? The dark day was a sign, it wasn't a judgment.
Yeah.
Yeah, no, okay, yeah, I get it. I just kind of wondered, that was all. No, that's cool, thanks.
Margaret. Margaret, you still on mute?
Sorry. Revelation 8 verse 10. The third angel sounded, and there fell a great star from heaven. That great star from heaven, would that be Satan? Or who would that great star be? Burning as it was were a lamp. And
There are several different interpretations, but from what I've looked at, these, especially the first 4 trumpets, are all dealing with judgments against Rome. And that's how I've seen it. That's the historic Adventist view. And that's how I understand it. It seems to match within the context of what we've seen so far with the opening of chapter 8. I suppose we'll get into more detail of what these different symbols mean as we go through.
yeah, I've just realized in verse 11, it's got the name of the star is called Wormwood. So it's obviously, to me, that can't be Satan.
Remember, like, while angels are referred to as stars, also God's messengers, as in his leaders in his churches, are also referred to as stars in a couple of places. In Joseph's dream, how he said that he saw the sun, moon, and 11 stars bowing down to him. The 11 stars were the other tribes of Israel. So again, sometimes stars are referring to God's people or the leaders of God's people, and sometimes they're referring to angels. So these are different things the same symbol can refer to. So when we get to that, we've got to look at the context of that to see which, I suppose, what symbol is it drawing on.
Right, thanks, Matthew.
But as we said, these first 4 are 4 judgments against Rome. And as I was reading through some history on this, one historian commentator said that when you track the fall of the Roman Empire, there are 4 specific events that led to its downfall and destruction. And I found that interesting, that fit quite well, because here in Revelation, these 4 trumpets against Rome for its part in persecuting God's people, and the history says there are 4 specific events that led to its downfall. The first one is actually the invasions of the Goths, the Visigoths. A bit of history I've got here is in AD 395. I'm not sure how to pronounce his name. Alarchy, some Gothic name. One of the Visigoth Goths came down and he occupied the sort of the Greece area. Originally in his invasion, he had a force there, and the Emperor of Rome gave him the land so that he could defend them from other northern tribes that would come down. And he was made the commander of that area. But he spent all that time preparing his forces for the next few years to launch an invasion of the Western Roman Empire. And it's just interesting. Edward Gibbon, one of the author of The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, reports that from a couple of different sources, the king of the Goths here said that he didn't actually want to conquer Rome, but he kept having this urge that he had to do this as his duty. Something kept coming up and nagging him that he had to do it, that he could not rest until he had beaten down the gates of Rome. And so he did. For the first time in over 600 years, the capital of Rome had fallen by the hands of this man. And this marks the beginning of the barbarian invasions of the Roman Empire. And that lines up here with this first trumpet, this first judgment against Rome, at the hands of Alarchic of the Visigoths.